Contributing properties into a joint venture that might result in a development is a very, very common feature, especially when you're looking at developing areas and even your Santons and Rosebanks, where there's older properties there where people they don't necessarily want to sell the property, they want to benefit from the upside of having this great property at a very high value that's capable of being developed, but they don't necessarily want to sell it. They want to stay involved in the development. So this is a very common feature. And in our space, we either refer to it as JVing or some kind of development collaboration, right? Now, there's a number of ways of doing this. Now, with this particular question, the first obstacle that we need to overcome is the fact that these individuals are married in community of property. She owns a property with her brother, and obviously she's married in community of property with her husband. So the first thing that needs to be kept in mind is that in theory, there's two half shares, and the one half share is actually owned by herself and her husband, and the other half share by her brother. Now, can she acquire her brother's half share? Absolutely, she can. And that is a simple sale. She acquires the half share, and her husband, in theory, become owners of this property. So that's step number one in order to bring this property home, as it were. Now, her husband's company is actually the company that's going to be undertaking the development. And by contributing this property into that company, there's going to be a payoff, and the payoff will be by way of a certain amount of units. Again, very common, because at the end of the day, when a person does a contract like this, you either get paid a price, such as a purchase price, or you get compensated with units that carry a value. It's actually the same thing. You're being compensated for giving an asset, and that is in fact the purchase price, but instead of cash, it's simply in kind. So all of that is quite simple to understand. Now, the question really is, how do you want to undertake this development, and what happens to the property during the course of the development? And this is where people have a variety of different options, and depending on you as a seller, you need to decide which option works for you. So for a second, I'm going to ignore the fact that it's in her husband's company that's going to be undertaking the development, and I'm going to try and design this in an arm's length way. I own a property. I want to be part of the development of this property. What do I do? First option, retain the property, allow the developer to begin work on the property, and when the time comes to sectionalize and sell, you at least actually have ownership of that property, and the developer shares in the proceeds of the sale. A lot of developers don't want to do this, number one, and developers that rely on financing also don't like doing this, because a lot of the financiers want to see that the developer actually owns the asset. So it is an option for smaller developments, but typically not for the larger developments. Second option is to sell the property to the developer holds it, and you simply wait for your purchase price, which is contingent on the sale of units after a certain period of time. That's also doable. It happens very, very frequently. Please be careful. Smaller developers might go bankrupt, and if they hold your asset, that asset's going to be sold in order to cover their debts. So with small developers, definitely wouldn't recommend this. Now, the other option, and this is the feature of this question, is when a property is contributed in exchange. So what we typically do in these type of situations is we create what's normally called an SPV. That's a special purpose vehicle for the development. The property is moved into the special purpose vehicle, and the owner of the property receives shares in exchange. So this is an asset for share transaction. You get shares in exchange. Now, you tie these shares into the units. So when the units are developed, you cash in your shares, you receive the units, and job is done. Now, why this works really, really well is initially, it's not a sale in the normal sense. When you move this property into the SPV, you can do it on a tax neutral basis. Again, I'm going back to Section 42 that we spoke about ages ago. Section 42 states, asset gets moved to company. The person that gives the asset receives equivalent shares in the company, and guess what? SARS goes, don't worry about capital gains. Don't worry about transfer duty. Don't worry about VAT. It's all good. we can pay that later when the property is sold. So it's a nice tax neutral way. And why this works is the cash flow initially is a lot less than trying to now cash flow the movement of a property into a SPV. You can do away with all those costs, move it cash free, and simply receive shares, after which you can cash them in for units in exchange, or it can also be structured as a purchase price. But now, obviously, we start getting into a lot of detail. So it can be done. Those are the typical options that we normally explore, but it's really up to the seller and the purchaser. So, and the last point that I'm going to make, if the person asking the question has asked that they want to keep the purchase price as low as possible. Now, if you do this as a normal sale, right, and you don't do it in terms of Section 42 in exchange for shares, and you do it contingent to receiving units later as a purchase price, please bear in mind that SARS will question the value of the property. And because you're moving it to a company that actually involves your husband, you reducing the value is going to be completely ignored by SARS, who's going to revalue the property and will charge you transfer duty on that value and will calculate the capital gains accordingly. So unfortunately, the only benefit of trying to reduce the value is potentially from a financing perspective, and it can be done. You can sell it for whatever you want to sell it, but just bear in mind that in SARS's eyes, they're going to completely ignore that, and they are going to deem the correct market value on the sale of that property.